The story begins in Murengo, a village that had never learned to fear change because change had always moved slowly there, like a distant cloud that takes years to decide whether it will become rain or disappear entirely, where every path was known by memory rather than maps, and every house carried the echo of voices that had lived within it for generations, yet on a morning that carried an unusual heaviness in the air, a black car entered the village, its tires cutting through the red earth road like something unfamiliar carving its way into a living memory. And from it stepped a man no one recognized, dressed in a way that did not belong to the dust and simplicity of the village. His presence too composed, too deliberate, as though he had arrived not by accident, but by decision already long made elsewhere. He did not greet anyone. He did not ask for directions. He simply stood at the center of the village, beneath the old mango tree where elders usually gathered when something important needed to be discussed, and he looked around slowly, not with curiosity, but with calculation, as if every house, every fence, every shadow of movement was already being measured against an invisible plan. Children who had been playing moments earlier began to slow their laughter without understanding why, and even the air itself seemed to settle differently around him, as though the village had instinctively recognized the arrival of something that did not belong to its rhythm. It was Mama Angeri who approached first, her steps careful but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had seen generations come and go, without fear of outsiders. And she asked him plainly what business he had in Muyango, her voice steady but alert, and the man finally spoke, his voice calm. He said he was looking for land, not a piece, not a parcel, all of it. Every house, every field, every boundary, every path that connected them. For a moment, there was silence so sharp it felt like it had weight. Then came nervous laughter from a few villagers, the kind of laughter people use when reality feels too absurd to accept. But he did not react. He did not smile. And slowly that laughter faded, leaving behind something more uncomfortable than fear: uncertainty. In that village lived Amina, a young woman whose life had never extended beyond the quiet responsibilities of a home near the river. Modest house built by her late father, a place where every crack in the wall held a memory and every object had been placed by hands that were no longer alive, yet still present in feeling. And she was known not for wealth or influence, but for her quiet kindness, for the way she helped others without making them feel small, and for the way she carried dignity even in simplicity. That morning, as whispers began to move through the village like wind through dry grass, she felt something she could not name. Danger, exactly, but displacement, as though the village she knew had shifted slightly without warning. By afternoon, the stranger's presence had already begun to take shape as rumor. His name, they learned, was Daniel Kato. No one knew where he came from, and no one could agree on what he wanted beyond what he had already said. But what they all noticed, what they could not ignore, was the way he moved through decisions as if outcomes were already decided before anyone else was consulted. Spoke little, but when he did, people listened longer than they intended to. There was something about certainty that quiets doubt before it has a chance to speak. That same day, Daniel made his first offer, not to the elders, not to the strongest household, but to Kofi, an aging farmer whose home had begun to lean with time, whose hands were cracked by years of labor that had never yielded enough comfort. And when Daniel spoke to him privately, the amount he offered was more than Kofi had ever imagined seeing in one lifetime. Enough to live, enough to rebuild, enough to stop struggling. And Kofi stood there for a long time without speaking, because sometimes survival is not a choice between good and bad, but between continuing and escaping. By nightfall, the decision was made, and by morning, the first house in Muriango had been sold. Mina saw him leave. Kofi did not announce it. He did not celebrate. He simply walked away carrying a small bundle of belongings, his eyes fixed on the ground as though looking up would make the reality heavier than he could bear. And for reasons she could not explain, Amina felt no relief for him, only a tightening in her chest, as if something irreversible had just been set in motion. Daniel, meanwhile, did not acknowledge the departure beyond a brief mark on a folded map he carried with him, as though a life, a home, a history could be reduced to a single confirmation. As evening approached, Daniel stood once again beneath the mango tree, studying the village with the same quiet intensity. And though Owen could hear his thoughts, there was a growing sense that he was not discovering the village. He was cataloging it. That silence, the first real question, began to spread to Muyango like a slow poison. Why would a stranger want to buy everything? And what happens to a place when it is no longer owned by those who live inside it? By the time night fell, the village was no longer just a village in thought. It had become something unstable, something negotiable. And Amina, lying awake in the darkness of her small home, listening to the unfamiliar weight of silence outside her window, understood something she could not yet fully accept, that the life she had always known was no longer guaranteed to remain hers. The second phase of Muriango's transformation did not arrive with noise or force, but with repetition so steady began to feel like fate, as though what was happening had always been waiting beneath the surface and only now found the right moment to rise. It was already too familiar to resist easily. Daniel Kato did not rush. He did not pressure in obvious ways. Instead, he expanded his presence through patience, through timing, through the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to raise his voice, because every offer he made already assumed acceptance as its natural outcome. Kofi's departure, there was no celebration, no announcement. Only another mark added to his map, and that map, once a simple folded sheet of paper, now felt like something heavier, something symbolic, as if the village itself was being rewritten line by line. The next to be approached were not the strongest, but the most vulnerable in different ways. Widow struggling to maintain her roof through each rainy season. A young man burdened by debts he could not explain to his family without shame. A couple arguing quietly each night about whether loyalty to land was worth more. Daniel never spoke to them with aggression. He spoke with certainty and calm alternatives, presenting escape as opportunity, departure as advancement, and slowly the meaning of loss began to blur inside the village, replaced by a more confusing idea that living might actually be a kind of success. And when people began to accept, they did so not because they were forced, but because the pressure of uncertainty had become heavier than the weight of belonging. Amina watched all of it unfold like someone trying to recognize a familiar face that kept changing expression every time she looked directly at it. She saw how conversations at the river became shorter, how neighbors who once shared meals now avoided discussing their futures, how every mention of Daniel's name carried both curiosity and unease. Something deeper than property was shifting. It was trust. The invisible structure that had always held Moyango together was beginning to loosen strand by strand. One afternoon, Daniel came to Amina's home without announcement, standing at her doorway as if he had already been there before and was simply returning. And when she saw him, she did not invite him in. She did not step back either. There was a stillness between them, the kind that forms when two people understand that what is about to be said will not remain harmless. He told her directly that he wanted her land as well, not as a negotiation. His voice remained calm, but his words carried finality, as if the outcome had already been decided in a place neither of them could see. Amina listened without interruption, and when he finished, she refused him immediately. Not loudly, not emotionally, but with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. Told him the land was not separate from her life, that it carried her father's memory, her childhood, her identity, everything that could not be replaced by money or moved elsewhere. For the first time, something subtle changed in Daniel's expression, not surprise recognition, as though resistance was not an obstacle, but a known variable he had expected to encounter eventually. He said quietly that everything had a price, and Amina answered that not everything that matters can be reduced to price. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense like air before a storm that has not yet decided where to break. Daniel studied her for a moment longer than necessary, and then, instead of arguing, he simply said, "We will see," and left, even behind a feeling that did not dissipate when his footsteps faded. That night, rain returned to Moriango with unusual intensity, striking rooftops and earth alike until sound itself became overwhelming, and in the spaces between thunder, the village felt less like a place and more like something exposed, something unprotected. Amina lay awake listening, not only to the storm outside, but to the growing realization that the world she had understood all her life was no longer stable. Outside, some homes now carried new ownership, others waited, and waiting, she began to realize, was its own kind of surrender when uncertainty is the only thing left to hold. By the end of that week, nearly half the village had changed hands in paper, if not yet in spirit. Daniel's map was no longer just a record of transactions. It had become a quiet transformation of reality itself, marking absence where presence had once been unquestioned. Yet, what unsettled Amina most was not the speed of change, but its softness. Nothing was being destroyed, everything was being absorbed. And in absorption, resistance becomes harder to name. And still, she could not shake one question that grew heavier each day. If a stranger could buy a village without forcing anyone, what exactly was being lost first, and or the meaning of belonging itself? By the time the third phase began, Muriango no longer felt like a place standing on solid ground, but like something suspended between what it had been and what it was slowly becoming, as if every path, every home, every familiar sound now existed under a shadow of revision. And the villagers who remained began to understand a quiet truth they had not dared to name before. It was no longer about whether the stranger would take everything, but how long it would take for everything to quietly agree. Daniel Kato had changed in presence, though not in demeanor. He still spoke little, still moved with the same controlled calm, but now there was no longer any need for persuasion. The pattern had already completed itself in motion. Enough people had saw that resistance no longer formed a wall. It formed scattered fragments, isolated and easier to navigate. And in that fragmentation, something more unsettling emerged. Acceptance disguised as inevitability. The village council, once firm in its unity, now found itself divided in ways that were not openly spoken but deeply felt. Some elders argued that cooperation was the only way to preserve what little influence remained. Others insisted that something fundamental was being surrendered without full understanding. But arguments require shared ground. and Muriango no longer had enough shared ground left to hold consensus firmly in place. Amina stood at the center of this weakening balance, though she never asked to be. People began to look to her not because she had authority, but because she had refused when others had not. Her refusal became a symbol, and symbols are dangerous because they attract both hope and pressure in equal measure. She felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered, in the way neighbors asked indirect questions that were really pleas disguised as curiosity. Then came the shift that changed everything from transaction to revelation. Daniel returned to her, not as a buyer this time, but as someone carrying a different weight entirely. He did not bring an offer. He brought documents, maps layered with historical records, old land registry papers, copies of agreements signed long before he ever arrived in Muriango. He placed them before her without ceremony, and for the first time his calm expression carried something close to fatigue. He told her the truth, but not all at once. It came in fragments, like something too heavy to release in a single sentence. The land, he said, had not always belonged to the village in the way people believed. Decades earlier, it had been part of a contested transfer, tied to external investors and local officials whose decisions had displaced families, including his own promises had been made. Compensation had been implied. But what followed was silence, delay, and eventual disappearance of accountability. His family, among others, had been forced away without closure, without restitution, without even recognition that something unjust had occurred. Amina listened. And for the first time since his arrival, the story of Daniel Kato stopped being a mystery and became something sharper: history. Not justification, but origin. And yet, even as truth emerged, it did not settle cleanly into moral clarity. Instead, it fractured into questions that had no easy shape. Daniel said he had spent years building himself beyond that loss, returning now not for revenge in its simplest form, but for correction, restoration. A reversal of ownership that would erase the imbalance entirely by reclaiming what had been taken. His voice did not rise. It did not accuse. But beneath its control, there was something unresolved, as if the past had never stopped speaking inside him. Amina looked at the documents, then at him, and asked quietly what no document could answer. If you erase what was built after injustice, do you restore justice or simply extend the cycle under a different name? The question did not produce immediate response. For the first time, Daniel did not answer quickly. His silence stretched longer than any silence before it, and in that space, something unspoken shifted between them. Not agreement, not conflict, but recognition that the path he had chosen was no longer as clean as he had believed. Outside, the village continued changing without waiting for resolution. Final holdouts were shrinking into isolation. Roles were being redrawn on official papers that carry more authority than memory. Even those who resisted found themselves surrounded, not by force, but by administrative certainty. The kind of certainty that does not argue, it simply replaces. And Amina realized something that tightened her chest with quiet unease. The danger was no longer just loss of land, was the rewriting of meaning itself. If ownership could be rewritten this easily, then belonging could be erased just as smoothly. And if belonging disappeared, what remained of a village except coordinates on paper? That night, Moyango felt smaller than it had ever felt before, not physically, but emotionally, as if the space between people had widened even when their houses remained standing. And in the center of that shrinking world stood a man who had come to reclaim what he believed was justice, and a woman who now understood that justice, when pursued without reflection, can begin to resemble the very thing it was meant to correct. By the time the final chapter of Muriango's transformation began, the village no longer felt like a place resisting change, but like a place holding its breath, waiting for the last word to be spoken so the silence that followed could decide what it would become next. As if aware that something irreversible was approaching its conclusion. Only a few homes remained outside Dana Kato's ownership now, and among them, Amina stood like a final question no one had managed to answer. The rest of the village had already shifted into a strange dual existence, physically present yet legally redefined, still standing in form, but no longer fully belonging to those who lived within it. And that contradiction weighed heavily on everyone who remained, because uncertainty had finally matured into something more stable than hope. Anyo did not behave like a man celebrating victory. If anything, he grew quieter. Calm that had once felt like control now carried something closer to exhaustion, as though every step forward had taken more from him than it had returned. The documents were nearly complete, the signatures nearly aligned. What remained was a final decision that no longer depended on persuasion but on will. He came to Amina one last time at dusk, when the sky over Muriango turned the color of fading embers, and the village seemed suspended between day and night. And he did not bring an offer. He brought finality. He told her that the process would complete with or without her consent, that what she was holding on to was now surrounded on all sides by ownership that had already shifted, and that resistance, at this stage, his voice was steady, but underneath it, something unsettled moved, something that sounded less like certainty and more like burden. Amina stood in the doorway of her home, the same home her father had built, with hands now long gone, and she felt the weight of every memory inside it pressing against the present moment, not as weakness, but as proof of existence. She asked him quietly if he had ever stopped to consider what would remain after everything was reclaimed, not on paper, not in ownership, but in life. Daniel did not answer immediately. For once, his silence was not strategic, it was searching. And in that searching silence, the truth that had been buried beneath years of intention began to surface with painful clarity. What he was building was not restoration, but repetition. A mirror of the same displacement he had once suffered, only reversed in direction, but identical in consequence. In trying to correct erasure, he had begun to recreate it. Amina stepped forward and told him something that did not carry anger, only clarity. That justice without reflection does not heal what was broken. It only ensures the breaking continues under new ownership. That pain passed forward does not become correction. It becomes inheritance. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The wind moved through the trees behind them, soft but persistent, like time itself refusing to pause for human decisions. Then something in him shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, like a structure finally recognizing the flaw in its foundation. He looked at the documents in his hand, at the signatures that were meant to complete everything, at the map that had once represented purpose, but now resembled something far more fragile, obsession given structure. And then he made a choice that no one in Murango had expected. He did not sign. Instead, he cancelled the final acquisition process, not in anger, not in defeat, but in recognition. A decision that felt less like loss and more like release, though it carried its own kind of pain. In the days that followed, Daniel initiated something no one had anticipated: a restoration framework. It transferred ownership back into collective hands, to a foundation established under the village's original identity. Compensation was arranged for those displaced earlier in the process. Legal structures were put in place not to erase history, but to acknowledge it without repeating it. It was not perfection, it was repair. Muriango did not return to what it had been. That was impossible. Too much had shifted, too much had been seen. But it began, slowly and unevenly, to become something new, something more aware of its own fragility, but also more conscious of its value. Amina walked through the village days later and noticed the small returns of ordinary life, conversations resuming without hesitation, children playing again without watching the edges of adults' faces, for fear neighbors meeting each other's eyes without immediately calculating distance or loss. The land remained the same, but the meaning of it had changed. And this time not through ownership but through understanding. One morning, Daniel prepared to leave without announcement. There was no ceremony, no gathering, only the quiet certainty of departure. Before he went, he stood once more near the old mango tree, the place where everything had begun, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the village itself remembered every version of him that had passed through it. Observer, buyer, inheritor of grievance, and finally something quieter. Amina met him there. No anger, no gratitude, only acknowledgement of what had passed between them. She asked him what he had learned. He looked at the village for a long time before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty it once held. That power without understanding only repeats harm in new shapes. That justice pursued without reflection risks becoming another form of erasure, and that sometimes holding on is not about ownership but about remembering what must not be repeated. Then he left, and Moriango remained not unchanged, but still standing. And in that continuation, something fragile but real took root again. Not just land, not just ownership, but the possibility that a place, once broken, can still choose not to break itself again.